experience stress and difficulty in some form, and advantage and safety and goodness in some form. And part of being self-aware is investigating the different sources of trauma or stress that we've had to deal with in our life. This can help us know ourselves better, and it can also help us figure out the best pathway towards healing when we can make these distinctions. So, the definition of trauma that I'm working with is that trauma is anything that overwhelms our capacity to cope and respond, and it leaves us feeling helpless, hopeless, and out of control. All right, so just make sure you're staying grounded as I'm talking about this. Stay connected to your breath if you can. You can also remember to look around and stay oriented in your space. This video is just a broad strokes overview, okay? So trauma, anything that overwhelms our capacity to cope and respond. The first type of trauma I want to talk about is called shock trauma. Shock trauma is an event that happens to us, and it happens too fast, too soon, and it overwhelms our capacity to cope and respond. Shock traumas are things like car accidents, natural disasters, violence, witnessing violence, even things like death of a loved one, divorce can be shock traumas. Typically, shock traumas impact our nervous systems such that the nervous system can get trapped in the past. We can get trapped in a freeze response, a fight or flight response, or a shutdown response. What we know from the trauma literature is that when we experience these overwhelming events, our body mobilizes to deal with the event. We have all this energy that emerges. When we don't release that energy, it gets stuck in our bodies, and then it's trapped inside of us. In general, when we're dealing with shock traumas, we're working on recalibrating the nervous system, discharging traumatic stress energy, and building our capacity to deal with life again. The second kind of trauma that I want to talk about is called developmental trauma. And developmental trauma has to do with an ongoing misattunement between the child and the primary caretaker. With developmental trauma, you don't necessarily look back and say this bad thing happened to me. It's a little bit more insidious. So human babies are 100% dependent on their primary caretakers to survive. We rely on their ability to attune to us so they can meet our needs. Ideally, when a baby cries, the caretaker is able to respond, to check in. Are you hungry? Are you tired? Are you wet? Do you need to be held? Ideally, the caretaker is able to meet that need fairly consistently. If that happens, the child will internalize that the world is a fairly safe and predictable place, and when they have a need and they express it, that need can be met. But when that doesn't happen consistently enough, somebody can suffer from developmental trauma. So imagine that the caretaker has their own trauma. Maybe the caretaker is depressed or struggles with addiction or wasn't attuned to themselves, and so doesn't know how to do that for the child. In this case, the child might cry and the caretaker might just go into the other room and sleep, or the caretaker might yell at them, or worse, hit them. When we don't receive that attunement, we internalize something else about the world. The world is unsafe. My needs don't matter. My needs are not going to be met. All those negative things. Whatever imprint we have in those early childhood experiences can carry on into our adult relationships. And they can make adult relationships confusing. They can make it so that we're constantly drawn to abusive partners or abusive friendships because it's all we know. It replicates our original experience, right? With developmental trauma, the healing is a little different than a shock trauma. Yes, we're going to use somatic tools to regulate ourselves, but developmental trauma is healed in relationship. So whether it's a really healthy therapeutic relationship where you can work through these issues with a therapist, or really healthy friendships and intimate relationships with people who are really willing to do the work and do the healing work with you, right? Now, in my life, for example, I have a little bit of developmental trauma. It's not my primary trauma, but I grew up in a household where my father was alcoholic and was very, very moody. So when I was little, I was attuning to him. I would attune to Is daddy drunk? Is he sober? Is he in a good mood? Is he in a bad mood? I didn't get attunement from him. I attuned to him to figure out what my environment was going to be like. Now, that's a trauma in that he should have been attuning to me. But my trauma is also my gift. I'm like a really empathetic person. I can attune to clients and students. I'm really good at attuning to other people. My work is to attune to myself. What do I need? How am I doing? If you're the kind of person that tends to be a caretaker or a healer of sorts, that might be in your past, right? Now, luckily, I had my mom around who was very, very nurturing, a little maybe overly nurturing. So I didn't find myself stuck in unhealthy relationships for a long time. For sure, I had to go through my slew of unhealthy relationships to learn how to be in a healthy relationship, right? I don't think any of us just get into like the right relationship right away. Maybe some of you do. Most of us are learning. But some of you who might be struggling with more serious developmental trauma might find that it's especially hard, and you need to do some deeper work around that, okay? Now, shock and developmental trauma can go hand in hand. You can experience physical abuse by somebody you love. And so again, these aren't meant to be totally discrete categories, but rather just points of inquiry and ways to think about what kind of challenges have I had to go through, and what category might they fit in. And again, remember, these challenges have also given you your strength and your capacity. You might not feel all of that right now, but they might have the potential to give you some strength and capacity, right? Trauma doesn't have to be a life sentence. Resilience is real, okay? And my definition of resilience is that resilience, the typical one is it's our ability to bounce back from difficulty, but I don't think we ever just bounce back to where we were, right? Difficulty changes us, and that doesn't have to be a bad thing. So I think about resilience as our capacity to be transformed by difficulty, as well as our capacity to have a feeling that we will be okay if difficulty arises. We're always living into some imagined future, and with unresolved trauma, we can unconsciously always be imagining the worst. We can't imagine something different. Bessel van der Kolk says that trauma is loss of imagination. And when we begin to heal, we can start to imagine something better for ourselves. So the third category of trauma I want to talk about is systemic or institutional trauma, which also is cultural. So institutional trauma has to do with the ways that the institutions that are meant to care for us can harm us, target us, marginalize us, or not see us. And this is incredibly stressful and overwhelming and traumatic to many. What institutions are we talking about? Healthcare system, criminal justice system, education system, politics, finance, food systems. If you live in a body that's targeted by these systems, and so let me back up. Institutionalized trauma has to do with not having access to your basic needs based on your race, your gender, your ethnicity, your religion, your gender expression, your body size, your physical ability, the way that your brain works, etc. When we are targeted or not seen or not have our needs met because of the identity that we have, that can be overwhelming and traumatic. The stress that people of color and Black people feel walking out on the streets, potentially dealing with law enforcement, is overwhelming, right? The stress that a person with a disability might feel if they are not in spaces where there is access for them to enter into buildings and do what they need to do. The stress that a non-neurotypical child might feel in a school system that might see them as defiant or stupid just because their brain works differently. The stress that bigger-bodied people feel when they go to doctors and everything is blamed on them being fat is traumatic. It makes people not seek health care and not seek the help and the support that they need. I could go on and on. My point is that when these larger systems don't serve us, when we feel like they target us, it's traumatic. And these systems and the norms by these systems are often dictated by culture. Culture feeds policy, policy feeds culture. And so oftentimes these biases and this discrimination is also reinforced socially and culturally. So just check in for a moment. Notice if you have been a target of systemic or institutionalized trauma, if the body you live in, the religion you practice, your ethnicity makes you a target, and what you've had to do to overcome that. Now, the ways that we build resilience against systemic trauma partly is about not internalizing the messages that we're getting, not internalizing that we're not enough or we're not worthy or we're not smart. So there's some personal work to not take in, some folks call it internalized oppression. And for those of us who live in bodies that are not targets, to not internalize a sense of superiority, right? That we've somehow done something to earn not being a target. Because the trauma goes both ways. It's not just for the folks that are targeted by the systems, but those of us who benefit by other people being targeted. And I feel like I carry a lot of privileges: white skin privilege, education privilege, class privilege. There's ways that my privileges buffer me against the issues that other people are not buffered against. Usually, those of us who aren't aware of systemic trauma, we're not aware of it because we haven't had to deal with it. People who've had to deal with it are very aware of it. And I'm really passionate about talking about systemic trauma because often in mental health spaces, it's not talked about. It's being talked about more these days, for sure. But when we don't look at people's social location and their identity, we can blame them for their problems, blame them for being stressed out or overwhelmed or traumatized. And it's really important to give context to the lived experience that people have. The other way that we build resilience against systemic trauma is by changing the systems. And this is where, all the personal work in the world isn't going to necessarily change the systems outside. And this is where trauma work and activism, or trauma and social justice, actually go hand in hand. Until we are building systems that care for everybody, we can't be okay. And right now, what's happening with coronavirus is sort of really highlighting that until our most vulnerable people are cared for, nobody can be okay. Right? Who are the people most impacted by COVID-19? It's poor working class people and people of color. They're more at risk, and we're talking about here in the United States. I know we have folks in other countries here. They're more at risk because they have to get to work. They have jobs that they're essential workers. They don't have access to as good health care. They might have more underlying issues because they're dealing with more pollution in their neighborhoods, lower quality foods, lack of access to good quality food, or lack of access to good health care. So, and what we see with the spread of this virus is until we can get it contained, everybody is going to be at risk in different ways. And so even though this time is really heartbreaking, my hope is that the folks who haven't had to be awake to the negative impact of inequality are really feeling it as well. And that maybe this can help us really build a world where everybody is well and nobody has to deal with systemic trauma. So just take a moment to check in. I know this is a lot of information. And this month, the practices I'm going to give you are resilience building practices. All the practices I give you are about building resilience, but really thinking about and reflecting on what has shaped you. And in what ways is that maybe a wound? In what ways is it a strength, or does it have the potential to be a strength for you? So I hope you found this useful. You might have to go back and comb through this talk again. You might notice that there's certain parts that you felt really defensive against. Get curious about that. Or certain parts that you just kind of got distracted. Get curious about that. All right? Thanks, everybody.